Good morning, everyone. I'm Asha Nayaswami, and we're continuing with our Sheltering in Place Satsangs. We've been working with the way of Ananda Sanghi, which was Swamiji's articulation of the guiding principles of Ananda in a way that he never had done before. He wrote it in 2003 after he moved to India. And in the book, right there, this year-by-year account of Swami's life, all of it in much more detail is listed. The year. Okay, so there's 7 main points, and then there's also 7 sub-points to point number 2. And we're on the 7th of the subs. And the point number 2 is we believe that man's highest duty is to realize himself as an expression of all-pervading Satchidananda. And then Swamiji makes that, which is actually a universal statement, because the highest duty of everyone is to realize Satchidananda. And then he talks about the particular way within Ananda that we strive for self-realization. And he speaks of the inner silence and the carefully chosen acts of service to others, to honor everyone as an equal manifestation of God, friends and self-styled foes alike, he said, and to give back our ego attachments to the divine, to actually have an experience of God, not merely have a belief that we hope someday will be proven or not proven after we die, to be creative in all that we do. And Swami goes so far as to say in art and music, and meaning that not merely to be creative as an abstraction, but to actually use the talents that God have given us to make the world a more dynamic and beautiful place. Or, he said, by living creatively the life that we are given, if we're not inclined to be an artist. But as I was saying when I was dealing with that one, many paths to self-realization seek to transcend the ego by suppressing it. And so this is a notable shift, that creative self-expression is considered not to be an expression of ego, but when you learn to be a channel, it's a way of overcoming the ego. And then now the one we're at today, which is number 7, the last of the subs. We seek to make our every thought and action a radiation outward from the center of our being, and not to allow ourselves to become superficial reflections of the thoughts and actions of others. This is a very, very subtle and extremely important point. I remember when I was about 19 or 20 and was just beginning to have a very small experience of what it was to be an adult and to live into the world. I came to the spiritual path when I was 18. I moved to Ananda just before I was 24. I met Swami when I was 22. I was a sort of a not quite beatnik because I was a little too young, and not quite hippie because I was a little too straight. But I participated in counterculture ways of thinking and being. I remember when I was moving into the hippie period, which was around when I was 18 and 19, I realized that the way you dress, the fact that people dressed a certain way was entirely and only enforced by the fact that people would look at you oddly if you didn't. In other words, it was based on your being embarrassed. And if you weren't embarrassed, then you could wear any kind of outlandish costume you wanted to, because there was no law against being out of fashion. Now, I mean, that's a small thing, but for a young girl who's been trying to sort of find her place in life, realizations like that, although trivial in themselves, were a very serious sign of exactly what's being written here. We want to live our lives as a radiation from our own center outward and not become superficial reflections of the world around us. Swami Kriyananda has sort of a classic sense of taste. He has very, very good taste, but he's classic, not radical in it, and definitely not involved in fads. And he made the statement once, which you can dispute if you want to, that those who follow fashion it's because they have no taste of their own, that they can't really determine for themselves what they think is attractive, so they just go along with what everybody else says is attractive. I remember, um, I remember because clothes, being a female, I've thought about this a little bit. But I remember appreciating, especially lately, even as detached and outside of the whole sphere as I've been. I've lived 30 years in Silicon Valley, and before I was a Nayaswami, I had to dress in some way that would win people's respect and wouldn't be a burden for them to look at. So I had to pay enough attention, and I often thought that when the first fashion trend starts, everybody knows it's ugly. I mean, nowadays, so much of fashion, so to speak, is ugly. It's unflattering, it's dull, it's tamasic is the word I want to use. It's frumpy. It's really frumpy. And but when the trend starts, everyone knows it's ugly. And then after a while, it just kind of comes into your mind. And I remember there was a trend for women for a while to wear these really heavy black shoes, just big. They weren't necessarily boots, but they were just big, clunky black shoes. And they were hideous. They were not feminine. They did nothing to enhance anybody's well being. But I remember after about a year or two of that trend, I was in a store and I picked up a pair of clunky black shoes and I thought, oh, these are cute. I think I'll try these on. And then I realized it had gotten to me again. I really had begun to think this was an attractive shoe and I put it down, sort of ran out of the store. But we don't even have any idea how constantly we're picking up our values. Fashion is a very superficial one, as I said, relatively speaking. But we pick up our values, our expectations of life, our actions, the way we decide things. We just add it onto ourselves. I remember I watched this little child. I watched this child picking up an attitude. I was at this health club in Nevada City, which is where for a little while we played racquetball there. Some of us would go into town and play racquetball. And afterwards, I was sitting in this jacuzzi in the club. And there was a woman and her young daughter were there. And the woman was a perfect example of someone who doesn't radiate from the center. She had kind of a, voice that just came from outside of herself, and there was no connection with the rest of her. And we're there, sitting there in the hot tub, and she says, "Oh, the hot tub is fine, but I prefer the dry heat of a sauna," like that. And her little daughter's watching her. And then a moment later, her daughter says, "I prefer the dry heat of a sauna too," like this. I don't even know if the child knew what a sauna was, but this is how mommy behaves. This is how I behave. And I just had this picture going way out. She has a boyfriend. He wants to get a jacuzzi. She says, "No, I like the dry heat of a sauna." Just this whole cascading series of events because she just took what was handed to her. I mean, it can get much worse. You can think about racism. You can think about religious bigotry. You can think about people's just infatuation with television shows and celebrities. Like, where does all of this come from? I mean, it's just absorbed from the world around us. And most people do not stop and feel the reality from the inside. When I was about 20, I had a job in a law firm. Actually, it was probably a little older than that. It was about 20. I was just starting out in the world, and I had this little job. And there was a woman in the office who was getting married. And I had individualized myself to a large extent already, just by my very nature. But she was planning her whole wedding out of these magazines. She was turning the pages of the magazine. She liked this, she liked that. She was just choosing, and all of the things that she had to do were because of what she'd read in the magazines like this, and what was fashionable for a bride to wear this year. Naive as I was absolutely appalled. I thought, my gosh, this is her wedding. And being a bit of a romantic, it seemed like, this is one of the most personal things she's ever going to do. She's trying to make it match this magazine. She's deciding how she should get married from what this magazine is telling her she should do. And it was just like, it was horrifying to me. I don't know, I mean, naive as I was, and I will say that a person could have so little inner identity that they had to do things the way other people told them. And I thought, she's probably going to get divorced, according to the magazine, too. Because without any center of her own, how was she ever going to hold it through and have a real connection? The time would come, and then she would pick up a magazine about how to get divorced. I never kept in touch with her, but it seemed inevitable to me. And people live whole incarnations that way. And it's very interesting. Once you start thinking about living from the center outward, you start paying attention to the tones of people's voices, the way they move, their actions. And I know everyone has an Atman, everyone has an inner divine soul, everyone has a spine, but some people don't use them. It's the only way I can say it. Now, I'm not trying to put down the world, and I'm not trying to curse people who aren't like me. That's not my intention. But sometimes by the contrast, it wakes one up to what is really appropriate. Now, of course, everything else in the way of Ananda Sanghi is what gives us the power to do this. This is the first point under how to actually realize Satchidanandam is the inner silence. And that's the premise of being an Ananda Sanghi, is that every day we separate ourselves out completely from what's going on in the world around us. We go all the way back as deeply as we're able to our origin point, and we sit in the absolute silence. There's no fads, there's no trends, there's no public opinion, there's nobody telling you that your dress is ugly and why did you wear it like that. There's nobody telling you that you ought to feel this way. There's just the inner silence. And God made each of us with a dynamic, creative core, and that's one of the reasons, the point just above this one, to express our natural creativity in art and music, or simply by living creatively the everyday events of our lives. Because when we become connected to our point of origin, and our point of origin is where the divine energy comes into us and gives us life, and where from that point of origin we offer that life back. That's why the point before is we embrace the need to give back to our Supreme Source by offering up our ego attachments and self-identifying limitations. Because if we've identified with all these outward realities, then we're no longer identified with our inner source. But once we regularly sit in the inner silence and follow everything else that's printed here, then suddenly it's not possible to lose ourselves in the chaos of the external world. There's just a powerful pulse within us that demands that we live with integrity from the center of who I really am. And it's also a spiritual practice. It's a very good practice. Just whenever you're anywhere and any decision has to be made, or you're with a group, whatever it might be, just ask yourself, how do I resonate with this? Now, I don't mean to be self-involved. I'm not saying that everything has to go through you before it can be resolved. But just ask yourself, why do I believe this? Why do I think that this particular dress is pretty? Why do I prefer that kind of cheese? Why do I want to go to this restaurant and not that one? Why am I fond of this person and not fond of that person? Where did these ideas come from? Master said thoughts are universal, not individual, and we merely receive and reflect. So we're always going to be receiving and reflecting, but we want to receive from our superconscious and from the divine sources that we're trying to be in tune with, which we can only receive if we are habitually standing in that inner silence, even in the midst of activity. Swami Kriyananda said, whenever he found himself even slightly going along with any fad, he said he would always stop and pull back and re-examine his thinking and his position so that he just doesn't get swept up in it. Swamiji never used slang. Slang, it was really funny. Words have vibrations, and slang has a particular vibration, like, oh, that's cool, man, that's really cool, or something like that, or whatever phrase you're going to use, it has a vibration to it. And whenever, on the rare occasions when Swami used slang, he always did it for effect. But even if he just sort of, it slipped into vocabulary, when it would come out of his mouth from his consciousness, there would be this incredible dissonance, just this very strange dissonance. Once something had gone really badly, and Swami said, yes, it really did not work at all, and it wasn't pleasant. He said, in fact, it was, and he sort of went like this, in fact, it was the pits. He said like that. We would just burst out laughing. It was like he was picking up a specimen from the road and sort of asking what it was. And the other fad that everybody's so fond of is people, now of course people wear these shirts that have these almost random words, chaotic random words, but people also wear slogans and things like that. And somebody gave Swamiji a t-shirt from his own business, and partly out of devotion, Swami's friendship with that person, and also because it happened to be a very nice cotton and a very nice color, Swami started using it as a pajama top. But it was a pajama top, and it had this logo for this restaurant on it, a restaurant in another city that Swami had been hosted by this man. So it had the logo of the restaurant on it. And I would watch Swami walking around because he often would get up early and start writing. So then he would write for a few hours. And so by noon, even sometimes literally by the afternoon, he was still in his pajamas because the creative flow had just kept him. He didn't want to bother to stop and get dressed. In fact, he had a very fine collection of silk bathrobes because he said it was his business attire were bathrobes, and he enjoyed wearing bright colors and silk. Once he started living in India, he started getting them from there. When he was still in America, I sewed a few of them from nice silks that we had. But he would wear this T-shirt with a logo on it, and you'd see him standing there, and he would just when Swami would be anywhere, of course, he had this huge aura, this huge spiritual energy, and it was all committed to this restaurant. And it was just like there was this complete, just weird shift like that and see, other people just do that without thinking. They just commit themselves to somebody, to the San Francisco Giants, or whatever they commit themselves to. Like, this is who I am. This is what I proudly wear. Now people wear slogans, some of which are lovely, some of which are horrid. The only other time I saw Swami do it was, he had another pajama T-shirt that says, "Angels can fly because they take themselves lightly." And after he had his hip operation and was liberated to be able to walk and move more easily, somebody gave him a T-shirt that said, "Watch my smoke." and, and he wore that, but somehow that matched him because that was the mood he was in. Well, all of this is humorous, but it's an interesting example that Swamiji never let himself be influenced by just this wave of popular thinking, because he was always going to stand right within his own reality. So for us, we really need to, but this is part of introspection, when we ask ourselves, why do I feel this way? And do I really want to feel this way? I was talking to someone recently who, I was trying to help her make some better choices than I saw she was going to make. She had some very good opportunities in front of her, but she was not accepting them because she said, it's not the way I was raised. I said, you're 56 years old. Do you think it's time to let go of the way you were raised? It was sort of like, oh, I never thought of it. The person I was talking to is not notably strong in their center. They tend to just be batted about, but that's the kind of thing you say. Oh, it's not the way I was raised. Well, you're 56 years old, you're a grandmother. Like, at what point do you become your own person? And so this is what we have to ask ourselves continuously. I was raised in a Jewish family with certain characteristics. My brother was a state champion debater in all of the state of Texas for 2 years in a row. And our family communicated in the style of debate. And I don't mean that we were that there was hostility. It wasn't hostility, but you present your whole case in the most convincing way you can present it. And then the next person presents what they see as the objections to your case and what they think is the right case. And I didn't even know that that wasn't conversation, because that was just the way I grew up. It took me a long time to notice that when you aggressively present your whole case with all the reasons for it, not everyone really enjoys that way of relating. They feel like you're bullying them. But that's the way I was raised. And finally I realized, well, why would I continue it just because I was raised that way? And that's how we always have to keep standing back. This may be who I have always been. And this is also true on you get on the spiritual path, people's political orientations, their expectation of social mores, the people that they like and they don't like, just all of these things. We don't want any of them, because the point, before this, the point number 4 is that we offer up every ego attachment and every self-identifying characteristics. So when we go back to our origin point, there's no self-identifying characteristics. There's just pure spirit. And what we want to add back on is what God gives to us, not what man imposes on us. So I suggest, even just as an observation, just watch other people. I actually really began to understand it even more deeply when I met a woman who, she worked for a bank, and we were dealing with her. I actually decided, as I said about someone else, that I actually think she didn't have an origin point. I think she was probably a unique specimen of God who had no origin point. She lived entirely, as far as I could see, in reaction to the world around her. She was probably one of the most restless people I've ever seen. She had no point of rest. But seeing it in extreme form made me realize the same seeds within myself and begin to embrace the need to think it through and not just parrot back, whatever's being said around us, and not a superficial reflection of the thoughts and actions of others. Okay, so now we've finished point number 2, and here's point number 3. We seek never to convert anyone to our specific cause, except in love, to inspire all with the desire to reclaim the bliss of their own being. Now, this is also a very important nuance, because there are many religious traditions that are evangelical, if that's the right word for this, that are evangelical in nature. They evangelize. As a fundamental part of your religion is that you're supposed to go out and convert others. The Mormons, every Mormon goes out on these 2-year missions where you go, wherever you go, you knock on doors. At least that has been true. You knock on doors and try to persuade people to become Mormons. Born again Christians feel they have a divine duty to try to save everyone from going to hell by telling them about Jesus Christ. So there's this constant outgoing looking for converts, as a fundamental dogma, a fundamental tenet of the religion itself. Swamiji says, as an Ananda Sanghi, we seek never to convert anyone to our specific cause. Cause meaning, our path, our way of doing it, the Ananda Sanghi way, except, he said, to love, to inspire all with the desire to reclaim the bliss of their own being. And so we are outward looking. So this is also, again, a very fine definition. It could be said, and has been said by certain groups, you have no responsibility for anyone else. Just live your own life. Try to realize God. And it's presumptuous. It's not necessary. This world is a dream. It's all in the hands of God. Their karma will take care of them. There are lots of justifications. I'm not mocking any of them. It can and could be a very valid way, which is just turning your back on the world. But our path is different. We're not trying to turn them into Ananda Sanghis, but we do want to love them and inspire them to reclaim the bliss of their own being. So how do we do that? We do that primarily by love and inspiration. And love and inspiration is not the same as dogmatism. Swamiji was traveling in Jerusalem once, and he was accosted by a fervent Christian, and how did he say it? Do you believe that Jesus Christ died on the cross for your sins? And Swami just looked at the man and he said, how could God die like that? He didn't say anything else. He just said that. But that man's was opening it up to start an argument, to try to persuade, to break down Swami's resistance and make him become like him. We're not trying to do that at all. But we are wide open to helping people if we can. That's why we advertise what we do. That's why I'm talking through this camera and making this YouTube channel that's probably up to 1,000 videos by now, and doing everything we can to make what we're doing available, because we wish to inspire people to reclaim the bliss of their own being. Because part of our way is to recognize that we're all God's children and we can help alleviate suffering. But the way we primarily try to alleviate suffering is to help people reclaim the bliss of their own being. But the very nature of this path is that it must be inwardly motivated by the individual. Everything that you're reading here, these are not things that you can just write down, memorize, and then repeat. It's like you are either offering up your self-limiting self-definitions. You can't just say, I believe in doing it. You either do it or you don't. You can't just say, I believe in sitting in the inner silence. You either do it or you don't. Make your life a creative expression. So it's all active experience based. But if we can inspire people to understand that what they themselves are seeking, they will find through this path, then it is our divine obligation to do everything we can to deepen that understanding. The first time I went to India in 1986, and India was a much different country then. The influence of Gandhi was still quite strong, and India was still closed to foreign corporations. Gandhi's idea was that India would be self-sufficient in its own right, and that was still holding. But by 1987 or 88, when we came there, it had opened up, and once India was open to foreign corporations, everything began to change. But the first time there, driving through Delhi in the night, coming from the airport, and just seeing people living on the streets, sleeping in the median between the lanes, and even in the night there was just a huge amount of activity, and much of it was impoverished people. And just the first time I'd seen anything like that. You don't see that in Palo Alto. You see an occasional, usually mentally unstable homeless person, but not much else. And I thought to myself very deeply, the only solution here is consciousness, because we have all the resources and all the technology to make everyone quite comfortable on this planet, but we don't have the consciousness to want to do it. And what we need is to inspire people that we're all brothers and sisters in God. These words right here, if we all understand that we are brothers and sisters of God, of the same one progenitor, and if we are making our own lives, we're living from the inside, center of our origin, and making our lives a creative expression of our experience of that inner reality, then compassion is inevitable. But what kind of compassion? What is it that we have to give? And Ananda has never been politically or social activist. I mean, it doesn't hurt to, donate to homeless shelters and give leftover food. And, when our farm has excess in the harvest, we take it to a place where it can be used. I mean, of course, one thinks about that kind of generosity. But the real gift that the Ananda Sanghi has is to inspire people to seek the bliss of their own being. Because if we were all seeking the bliss of our own being, the world wouldn't be in the mess that it's in. And it's not naive to think that is the solution, because every major historical shift in the world, if you go back to the center of it, you will always find that there is at least a spiritually inspired individual, and often a small crowd or even a large crowd of people whose spiritual ideals have given them the power to influence the direction of the planet. And that this is where it comes from, not from trying to make them like we are, but as Swami said, I'm not here to convert you except to the joy of your own being. That's how he would put it. I want to convert you to the joy of your own being. Convert you away from a superficial existence in which you are but a superficial reflection of the thoughts and actions of people around you, so that you can live from the center of your own being and radiate outward from that divine attunement. That's what really makes us whole, happy, safe, and powerful. And isn't that what we all are seeking? God bless you.